Pennsylvania, Congresswoman Madeleine Dean. She is a friend and member of the Appropriations and Foreign Affairs Committee. So welcome, Congresswoman. So in classified briefings 2 weeks ago to the Foreign Affairs Committee, both secretaries, Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth, said the U.S. goal in Venezuela was not about regime change and left lawmakers on both sides of the aisle frustrated over their lack of a clear explanation for what the administration was trying to accomplish there. What is your response to the events unfolding over the last 18 hours or so?
Well, just extraordinary. I'm pleased to be with you on this extraordinarily challenging day. And to follow up on your reporting there, what exquisite work by our military. So I have extraordinary confidence in Chairman Kaine and our military, but extraordinarily troubling briefing by both the president and by the secretary. The secretary has said in not classified settings that he was not looking at regime change. The administration has said that if they were to go on land in Venezuela, of course they would come to Congress. Of course, they did not do that. And I had the chance to speak to the secretary following that classified joint briefing to Congress about the Venezuelan boat strikes. And I spoke to him particularly about how I thought any mission there didn't make a whole lot of sense in the face of the president's pardons of both Ross Ulbricht, the Silk Road drug trafficker, as well as former president of Honduras, Hernandez, him sentenced to 45 years for cocaine trafficking, 400 tons. Mr. Rubio said to me, "Oh, I had nothing to do with the pardons." Strangely, the president seemed to say differently. This is an unbelievably troubling time. The president acknowledged, and I wrote down notes, of course, that this was a military action and that we are going to run the country until such time. And then, of course, focused entirely on wealth and oil and taking the wealth of the country and not costing us anything. This is a very dangerous thing for him to have done. And of course, it triggers the War Powers Resolution, which means within 48 hours, Congress must have a briefing.
Speaking of that, we know that Congress was not briefed. The Gang of Eight was not briefed about these strikes beforehand. Secretary Rubio never spoke to Congress about any plans to arrest Maduro. Does the president have the unilateral legal authority to carry out large-scale strikes and capture the leader of a foreign country without congressional approval? Has this administration essentially declared war on Venezuela?
I would argue he does not have that power because it was not just capturing the leader. It was also saying we're going to run the country. We're going to run a sovereign nation. He does not have that unilateral authority.
All right. And he says he will do it until such time. We did, and I'm sure you heard as well, hear the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, say that this was not something that fell under the auspices of going in and extracting a foreign diplomat or the head of a country. It was merely an arrest. It was a simple arrest of somebody, a criminal who'd been indicted by the United States. Does that make all of this legitimate? And do you agree with that assessment?
Sadly, we cannot trust the words of either Secretary Rubio or the President of the United States. In that press conference, they were in direct conflict with one another. Secretary Rubio tried to make it about policing and just simply arresting the president. If that were the case, then we would not be taking over the country. I would think that the Constitution of Venezuela, that their elections would prevail at that point. We cannot trust the words of either Secretary Rubio, who said we would not be going in for regime change, and that the boat strikes was such a great deterrent about drug trafficking. Do you recognize how neither the president nor Rubio are talking about drugs anymore? It was never about drugs. They pardoned two of the biggest cocaine traffickers on the planet who had been sentenced, one to life imprisonment, the other to 45 years. I care desperately about drugs coming into this country. They didn't say one word about fentanyl because it's not about that. It's entirely about oil, the wealth of a different sovereign nation. And this president, you saw him, the vanity. He talked about the Monroe Doctrine, tried to call it the Donroe Doctrine. The only reason anybody would talk about the Monroe Doctrine and in some vain moment call it the Donroe Doctrine is if you are at an expansionist war. The president revealed his hands.
The president also declined to throw any support behind opposition leader Maria Corina Machado and suggested that Venezuela's vice president, whom he denounced in the strikes, will help the U.S. run the country. Does this mean the U.S. military will be something of an occupying force in Venezuela? I mean, when I heard former CIA Director John Brennan say a couple of times that he's certain U.S. boots will have to be on the ground to maintain security there, I'm curious what questions you have about the day after plan.
That's the problem all along. There doesn't seem to be a greater plan. And yet I want to reference what Chairman Kaine said. He talked about the planning in advance, the exquisite planning in advance. Notice that Congress was given no notice. And they tried to say something about they were worried about leaks as the president was flagged by Secretary Hegseth, a chief leaker among this administration. That is not an excuse not to bring this to Congress. And boots on the ground, you can tell from the president and from Mr. Rubio, they don't know the next step. They do not know. The president called it a gang. A gang will come together and somehow run this country. They do not have a plan for now, for today, and the chaos that this could bring. I was very sad that in that press conference, at least in that which I listened to, nobody spoke about the military members and what the president claimed in terms of injuries. I worry very, very much who was injured in this. And if we have boots on the ground there now and have boots on the ground there in the future, what war have we gotten ourselves into? Or has the president himself gotten us into?
That is unfortunately a rhetorical question right now. We'll see how it all plays out. Congresswoman Madeleine Dean, thank you so much.